Hello and welcome to the Kick Sugar Summit, the world's first summit on the topic of sugar, sugar addiction, and sugar addiction recovery. We know that if we're going to reverse our rising rates of chronic disease, we need to reduce or eliminate our consumption of sugar and refined carbohydrates. We are here to help you do that. There are a lot of speakers on our summit and a lot of information. Don't get overwhelmed. Catch who you can and just let the rest go. Alternatively, you could purchase one of our Summit VIP packages, which comes with an awesome ebook summarizing the core insights of each speaker, a year's worth of resources from our world of experts, and access to a whole year of weekly drop-in live Q&As with me, Florence, your host. Thank you for being here. I hope you love the summit, and I hope it changes your life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 9th Annual Kick Sugar Summit. My name is Sifi Livne, and I am so proud and honored to be interviewing today Angela Stanton. Angela Stanton is a PhD, MS, MBA, and BSc. She earned her doctorate in neuroeconomics, experimental neuroscience using the economic models, and is also fMRI certified, having earned the following degrees: PhD Claremont Graduate University in Economics with dissertation in neuroscience, fMRI certification at Harvard University, at Tanula A. Martineau Center for Biomedical Imaging, MS in Management and Science and Engineering at Stanford University, an MBA at UCR, BSc in Mathematics at UCLA. Her doctoral research focused on understanding how human decision-making is influenced by neurotransmitter changes. She ran clinical trial experiments, gaining an appreciation of the role hormones play in emotional and physiological decisions. A lifelong migraine sufferer, in 2008, Angela took early retirement from her academic career and has become an avid researcher of migraines. Her efforts to understand the cause of migraines has been assisted by thousands of migraine sufferers around the world. In 2014, she published the first, and in 2017, the second edition of the book, Fighting the Migraine Epidemic Complete Guide, How to Treat and Prevent Migraines Without Medicines, that established her as a leader in the field of migraine research based on nutritional and electrolyte management. She now teaches migraine sufferers and healthcare providers all over the world about how to abort and prevent migraines without any medication. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Zippy. Really nice meeting you. Thank you.
We always start by asking, how is your personal story and how you came to really be so passionate about this field of migraines and nutrition, especially?
It's a long one. I already gave my personal history in the past, so let me give you a different story this time. Let me explain how I came to actually the frustration. Because if you're looking at migraine, there's approximately 12 to 15% of the population globally have migraines. And this is a huge percent. This is a larger percent than most other conditions that afflict people. And these are just typically the migraineurs who actually have pain, because there's migraine without pain, which is usually sort of kind of disregarded. And there is no real treatment for it. We have lots of medicines, but most of them are not specific for migraine. And even the ones that there are for migraine, they have huge side effects. And most of the time they don't work. And it seems that the whole industry is just looking to sort of treat a symptom, but they have never ever looked for what the cause was. And this is what gave me a pause. And I started to do my research in about 2008. That's when I left academia. And I started to work on migraine, trying to understand, is there anything in migraine that I can understand and I can find, given that I've been a migraineur all my life, that so far eluded all other scientists? And so that is how I came up with what I came up.
Very interesting. So how did you come to, what was your conclusions about migraine, and where did that aha moment come?
Okay, so I was just asked yesterday, actually, by a doctor, this thing on Facebook, and it's a very long answer. So let me just cut to the chase as much as I can. When we're looking at our body, any symptom that we have, anything, whatever it is always, it's just a symptom, right? I mean, our body is telling us that there's something wrong or right, or maybe you're hungry, whatever it is, but it's a symptom. And unless say you're hungry, you don't know what it is, but you feel the hunger pains, you can treat it with medication, supplements, you can go vacation, do anything. It's not going to disappear until you actually eat, right? So you have to find what is the cause of the problem. And as it is for most health conditions, and I'm not going to use the word disease because I don't believe migraine is a disease, but as any health condition associated with humans, if you're looking at it, we don't really have a preventive cure. We may have some prevention, say, for example, for catching viruses. Okay, so you can prevent yourself from catching one if you really know what to do. You can't really prevent yourself from getting, I don't know, say your gallbladder be taken out, or so we think. And everything that we're looking at is just treated. So, like when you have a gallbladder problem, they're not understanding that it could be prevented. But once you have a problem with your gallbladder, then you no longer have a choice. You take it out or take medications. And so I went into saying, well, everything that happens around us is probably possible to prevent it. So why not look for migraine? Why not understand migraine, what it is, rather than just taking medications every time I get a migraine? Well, what is it? What's the pattern? What is the symptom? And in order for me to understand migraine, other than checking the pattern of when, and it's not just when the pain starts and when the pain stops, because most people run a diary, but it's more like, what did I do before the pain started? And what am I doing now to abort the pain? And how does it abort? And when do I get it next? I wasn't looking for the symptoms. Like all migraineurs have symptoms like sensitivity to the light and sound and smells. Those are symptoms. That's not like the light is bothering me. Otherwise, it's just something that in me not happening, because of which the light is bothering me. But 5 minutes earlier, it didn't bother me. See what I mean? So I have to sort of understand what were the differences. And to do this, it was very difficult because there are no articles in the field of migraine about this. None. You just simply can't find it. So in order for me to find any of my answers, I had to go back into physics, fluid dynamics, chemistry, biochemistry, cell physiology. I had to go through into organic chemistry and understand everything about the cell and understand how things connect and when do we get what kind of symptoms and why we get it. And if I have this, what does that actually mean in terms of my body if I go reverse engineer or where it's coming from? And it took over 10 years to sort of kind of scratch the surface. The number of articles I read, I was just talking to this doctor about it, were probably in hundreds outside of the field of medicine, looking at even the electrical activity of the brain. It's not part of any of the literature that you're familiar with. There's a lot of physics literature on the electrical activity of the brain, for example. How does it work? How does it not work? What's making it work? And how do the ionic channels actually work? I mean, there are just huge books on the topics, just on an ionic channel, a single ionic channel. And so it was a very complicated process. There is no direct road to the finding of what I found.
Reverse engineering, that's something I think that we need to do with a lot of conditions, and we just may be surprised by the commonality of so many of these conditions.
Exactly. Well put.
But speaking of commonality, how, especially for our listeners, because in headaches and migraines, like how do you differentiate between another type of headache and a migraine?
That's a very important question. And I find that about, I would say 30% of the people who are diagnosed with migraine actually don't have migraines. And so the distinction is very serious. So first of all, migraines can happen without headache. So when somebody has a headache, it doesn't automatically mean that it's a migraine. Because if I can have a migraine without a headache, then the headache is not even a requirement. Now I can have a headache with it, but the headache doesn't define the migraine.
So just so I understand, does that mean that not all headaches are migraines, but also not all migraines are headaches. Is that what you're
Exactly.
saying? Oh, that's
Exactly.
very
Yeah.
interesting because that's definitely a new concept for me.
It's not a new concept for the industry, but the industry seems to sort of kind of ignore it. Even if you go to the International Headache Society for the definition of migraine, you will have two kinds, one's with pain and one without pain. It's very well known that about 20% of migraines come without pain. Now, those are the 20% who come with aura. But I'm sure, I'm almost 100%, that we have migraines without aura and without pain. We just don't know about it. And that's because of the mechanism of migraine and how the brain tries to prevent migraine. But that's a very technical question. But back to your original question of how to distinguish a migraine pain from a headache pain. So given that we're talking about not two headache types, there are huge differences. So first of all, when you have a regular headache, it can hurt anywhere in your head. It can hurt all over your forehead. It's often people say that they feel like something is squeezing their head. It can hurt on the top of your head, can hurt in the back, but it's sort of kind of symmetrical through your head. A migraine is always unilateral. It's always on one side only. So you can't have it on two sides. It's usually one head. So the brain is not one thing, it's two hemispheres. And so if I have something not right in my right hemisphere, I will feel the pain on my left side. And so, or at least the symptoms will be on the left side. The pain, there's no pain sensor inside the brain. It's going to be always outside of the brain. But the other thing about the migraine pain is that, for example, it is defined to be over 4 hours. So if you have a headache and it disappears within 3 hours, it couldn't have been a migraine by definition. Now, whether this is a realistic definition or not is another story. My finding in my migraine group, which is now having close to 15,000 members, the main migraine group, is that most migraine headache lasts for up to 3 days. So I think the 4 hours is kind of a short, condensed form of the minimum 4 hours. But generally speaking, it's longer than a day. And of course, medications don't work for it at all. So over-the-counter medications. So if you're taking Advil or Tylenol, acetaminophen, whatever, ibuprofen, these are called in other countries, if your headache disappears, that was definitely not a migraine because the cause is different. And so for standard medication, standard headaches, over-the-counter medications will work. And also it is important to note that migraine requires, by definition, from the person to have at least 5 per month. So we have people who say, well, I had a migraine 10 years ago. Well, that was not a migraine, because in order for you to be a migraine sufferer, you need to have minimum 5 migraine episodes a month. And if you don't have that much, you're not, even if they appear to be migraines, I mean, there is a sort of like a build-up period to migraines where the migraine sort of intensifies over time as the person gets older. And so it may start with 1 or 2 a month, even though those may be already migraines, they're not yet defined as such because they don't happen so frequently. And then there's a chronic migraine, which is over 15 days a month. And so you have different varieties within the migraine. So a regular headache, you may have 1 or 2 a month. Those would not be classified as migraines.
Very interesting. So I know that you talk a lot about nutrition and the role of nutrition in migraine. And first of all, could you explain how you made that connection? Because of course we're here on the Kick Sugar Summit. So, nutrition and how to really, solve medical problems through nutrition is something that we're so passionate about. So maybe you can tell us first how you made that connection and then what is the role of nutrition in migraines?
Sure. So the connection is actually the heart of my so-called discovery in terms of what actually causes migraine and how to prevent it. Because over the years, as I was studying through the physics, as I mentioned before, and through a lot of very detailed ionic channel and biochemistry and electricity and understanding all the different parts of the brain and how they work, the neuron itself, what makes a neuron work, it made me understand the importance of the communication between neurons. So brain cells are called neurons. They look different and they behave different from other cells in our body. And we are born with the number of neurons that we have, and we die with the number of neurons. So we don't add neurons. We add connections, but we don't add neurons. So they are very different from cells in the rest of the body.
Right.
And to understand how the neuron works, that's an entire library in itself. So I spent a lot of time understanding. And of course, I have to also say there are very, very few other things in the brain from neuron. Our brain is basically gray matter, which are the neurons, and white matter, which are the insulation around the neurons because of the voltage, the electrical current that is generated as part of the communication. And so when you look at it, okay, so 85% of the brain is basically this white matter sort of thing with a little bit of a gray matter, and we have much more white matter than gray matter. So the insulation is tremendous. The white matter is the insulation, that's the myelin, and it's made from cholesterol and fat, just so that people know what it is made from, most from saturated fat on top of it. And so once you start looking at the brain, you say, wait, no other part of my body is made of cholesterol and fat. No other part of my body requires such insulation. So I must have really high power, something going on in my brain. And if you're looking at the electrical appliance, say a toaster that we are all familiar with, it has a very thin electrical, potential covering on it to insulate. But the brain has so much more. I mean, it's much more.
Plastic that goes around the wires. Are you talking about that?
That's
right?
really very thin, right? It's very thin relative to the actual current that is coming through to your toaster. But in the brain, when you're looking at the neuron and the amount of insulation around it, it's like several fold bigger. And so you would say, well, okay, my brain is clearly not plugged into the wall. So something is happening here. So when you're looking at what is happening, then the most important part of my discovery is how the brain organically creates its own voltage potential and how it carries this current. And so basically what happens is that if you have a neuron, say you have a neuron that's this big, it's unlikely to have it that big, but there are even bigger ones, by the way, but most have smaller. But basically the way it works is that there is a neuron body, which is the axon, where the electricity travels from the head of the neuron to the feet of the neuron. And the feet is where the boutons are, where the synapses are, which is a connection to other neurons, so that information can be exchanged. And so the whole purpose of the neuron is to carry this information. And for that, it uses this electric current that goes through the neuron. But there's no electrical outlet here plugged in. So the organic electricity has to be recreated by microscopic distances from each other. So basically what happens is there are little openings on the neuron all the way through where sodium is 40% of salt. It's sodium chloride is salt. So sodium goes in, starts the action potential, which creates the electrical potential difference. And it goes to the next opening where there is another voltage gated channel for the sodium to come in. And it's sort of kind of, think of it as a line where you carry the bouton in the, and run with it to the next opening, and where a new sodium ion is going to come in and pick it up and carry it. And so it goes by
from like sodium.
It's from sodium channel to sodium channel within the neuron. Okay. And so these are voltage gated channels, and sodium comes in, starts the electrical potential, and potassium comes out. This friction creates the electricity. And then when this particular gate is finished, then the electricity sort of kind of passed on to the next sodium. Then this particular gate is going to close while the potassium is going to come back in and a sodium is going to leave. So there's going to be an exchange of ions. And so when you understand this, that all there is to the brain is the exchange of sodium and potassium, okay, at this gate. And of course, it's calcium and magnesium, all part of this activity. And in between the only reason this is happening is because this neuron wants to send a message to the next neuron. And that message is in a little neuropeptide and neurotransmitter, could be serotonin, dopamine, or host of other kind of neurotransmitters, which could be a message that, hey, the light is turned on, or I just heard a fog horn down the street, or something similar. So everything that you see, hear, taste, smell touch, all of the sensory information, plus all other informations with respect to how your heart, your lung, everything is working, is operated.
Feedbacks, all the
It's a
body.
feedback system. And based on that, the brain then responds with new instructions. So there's a constant feedback between the brain and the body.
Mhm.
And so the brain needs a constant supply of sodium and potassium. Now, if you look at the supply of sodium and you look at the supply of potassium, of course, we eat both, right? That is how we get the sodium and potassium that we need. And sodium, I have to say this for the international listeners, that in every country other than the United States, salt is what is listed on foods. But in the United States, it is sodium. And so we differ in what we use. And this really helped me understand the concept, because sodium is the important part, not the chloride part. The chloride stays outside of the cells, it's differently charged. It's really just sort of kind of a supervisor of having everything in control in terms of the voltage potential of the cell. But the action is really happening through the sodium. And so when you're looking at then...
Wait, but I just do want to understand could you just maybe clarify a little bit the difference between the salt, like, is it what's different in the ingredients or what's listed in the ingredients?
It's what's listed on as ingredients. So you can't have sodium on its own. It's a metal that's really explosive. Okay, it's an ion. So ion means it's charged. It's electrically charged, and sodium is positively charged. And chloride, the other half of salt, is negatively charged. So the two form a bond, and together sodium chloride is salt. So what you can buy in the store is always salt. And it would be much easier to measure salt in your diet. So like if you buy, I don't know, if you buy a food that has salt cooked into it, it would be much easier if the label said how much salt is in it, because you can actually relate to salt. Like you can see it's a teaspoon of salt. You can't say what a teaspoon of sodium is because it doesn't exist. Okay, but in the United States, for whatever reason, it's going to give you a milligram of sodium. And so you literally have to always calculate back of what that is in the salt equivalent. But in the United States, we're used to sodium. So we only use sodium. And if I'm looking at my body of what is that I need to manipulate, it is actually sodium, because chloride is outside of the cell. So things that are, there are 3 places where things can be located in our body. They can be inside the cell. That would be called the intracellular. So potassium, over like 99% of the potassium in our body is inside our cell.
Mm-hmm.
And inside our cells, the potassium is protected. So you don't evaporate potassium. For example, when you go for a run and you're hot, you go in the sun, you don't evaporate it. You're not urinating that much potassium out because it's not in your blood. So it's not going to be excreted that way. It's a pretty stable element inside of your cells. And very few potassium ions are outside of the cell in the blood. And so when you get a blood test, for example, and you look at your electrolyte panel, then you look at sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, magnesium, CO2, and ion gap. These are the things that will be checked as electrolytes. And you're going to see that potassium is usually around 4 or 5 milliequivalent per liter. Sodium is like 145. So it's like significantly, it's like 33, 35 times more amount of sodium is in your blood. So the sodium in your blood is a temporary thing, because you perspire, you will lose salt or sodium in your sweat. When you exhale, you're losing a lot of humidity out of your body, and sodium is part of it. So you're exhaling salt humidity. So sodium is an element that you can actually lose just by simply sitting here talking to you. I'm losing sodium. I'm not losing potassium. I'm losing water and sodium. And so when I am losing a lot of sodium for whatever reason, that's going to be lost from my whole body, including my brain. And if I don't have enough sodium in my brain at the ionic channel where the sodium is needed to enter the cell to generate the voltage potential, I may not be able to start that voltage potential. So I had to understand what were the things that would affect how much sodium I have in my body. And I bumped into...
I think this is very important for people to understand, because people think that when they sweat, right, a lot, they lose liquid. But there's
Mhm.
other things that are, that we lose when we sweat, like you say, like salt, or, people don't think about the exhalation, like losing salt. This is, I think, a very important point.
It's an extremely important point, and depending upon, of course, the external temperature and the external humidity around you, this is going to change whether you have the heater on or the air conditioning on. I mean, there are just so many factors that are going to affect the amount of humidity or moisture in your body, and very specifically salt. It's not going to affect potassium nearly at all because it's not really that much in your blood, and it's not in the circulation the same way as salt or sodium is. And so it is important to understand then that when I eat something, what am I eating? Am I eating salt or am I eating potassium? And what way is the salt going to get into my blood where it should be, as opposed to getting into just my cells where it shouldn't be? And so understanding the two different ways of what is happening, like if I'm eating food, is that the same eating salty food versus drinking salty water? Are these two going to end up in the same place? And they don't. Because when I'm eating the food with salt in it, the food is going to absorb through my intestines into the cell. But when I'm drinking salted water, it's just going to be electrolytes going to go straight into my blood. So I will have a different behavior of the salt depending upon whether I'm eating it with food or drinking it with water.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's very interesting. And then so I bumped into this one book that is a medical manual, and it's really, really big with tiny, tiny, tiny letters. It's really used for hospitals and emergency rooms for to quickly page up of what you're looking for. And it's on the fourth page. I mean, it's organized by importance, not by alphabetical order, is the hyponatremia. Hyponatremia is when you don't have enough sodium in your blood. That is like one of the biggest emergency issues that people find in emergency. This is why when you go to an emergency room, the first thing they do is they hook you up to an intravenous saline solution. So you're getting salt water. And if you want to know how much salt is in that water, there's about a 3/4 teaspoon of salt per cup in that water. That's a lot more than what the FDA or any other dietary guidelines suggest, but that goes directly into your blood. So your blood needs a lot of salt. And so in the same book, I found that when you eat carbohydrates and the glucose enters your cell, in order for the glucose to enter the cell, it's going to immediately remove sodium and water. At that time, I didn't understand why this was happening. Now I understand it. It's because glucose entering the cell, it can't enter the cell. It needs transporters. And sodium is the biggest transporter of glucose into cells. It's called a co-transport. It's not insulin, it's sodium. That is the biggest transporter of glucose into cells. This is very important to understand because you all think about insulin as being the one taking glucose out of the cell, but that's incorrect. Only very few organs have even the kind of receptors on them that can accept glucose-driven or insulin-driven glucose into the organ. And this would be like our skeletal muscles is a huge sink for insulin-driven glucose. Also our lipids. People also realize that our lipids, our fat cells everywhere have GLUT4, which is the insulin-driven glucose. And I think the liver may be the next one. The brain is not even using it. It's not even one. Right. And so if I eat glucose from carbohydrates, be it sugar or fruit or vegetables, it doesn't matter, I'm going to cause an electrolyte imbalance because I'm removing sodium from my brain.
Okay, so basically but what about, like, everybody, if we talk about like salt, like ingesting salt, always this question comes up, isn't eating or drinking too much salt, doesn't it raise blood pressure and it's bad for people with heart conditions and things like that?
So there's two answers for this. First of all, when you eat salt, of course, as I noted earlier, eating and drinking links salt to different places. But so assume now that I'm just ignoring that. And I'm just going to say we're taking salt, okay? And the medical community knows very well it does not increase blood pressure. What it actually does, it increases blood volume. And that it does, because where salt goes, water will come. And so that is actually the goal of salt in the blood, is to retain the water in the salt, so in the blood. And so if you don't have enough water in your blood, you're drying up, you're going to end up, with thrombosis or other kind of issues. So you have to have water in your blood. Your blood is water based. And so taking salt is going to bring water into your blood. Taking too much salt can bring in too much water, and that can cause a problem. But our blood vessels are actually muscles, right? So they can constrict and they can dilate depending upon the amount of blood there's in our blood vessels. For people whose blood pressure increases when they take salt, it's because as the blood volume increases, their blood vessels aren't able to adjust. And so that's not the problem of salt. That's the problem of something else. It already happened. Their blood vessels aren't working. That's not the problem of salt. Salt doesn't cause a problem. They have a problem, which
but do they have to limit their salt intake?
They don't, because if they have appropriate kidney function, then the kidney works the blood through every 12 to 15 minutes. Every single part of your blood is fully replaced. So 5 times an hour, your blood is fully cleaned by your kidneys. And your kidney's job is to take, milliliter by milliliter or even smaller, and balance the sodium and potassium and water in your blood. That is its job. And so if you have a proper kidney function, then within 10 minutes, your blood pressure that may have increased as a result of increased blood volume is going to stabilize and go back to normal.
Okay, so I just want to understand, as someone who is not an expert in neuroscience. So basically what you're saying is, first of all, when we drink salt or when we eat salt, it behaves in 2 different ways. So if I let's say I did, some kind of, what's it called? Extreme sport, I sweated a lot. Here you would say, eat something salty or drink something salt. Does it make a difference if I want to, replenish the electrolytes and not just the liquids?
Oh, absolutely. Well, no, don't say liquid food. So when you do an extreme, I have many extreme athletes in my migraine group on Facebook, by the way. And somebody just ran a marathon, a Boston Marathon, and ran it just salt water and eating only carnivore. So when you're doing some extreme sport and you're losing a lot of salt and water as a result of ventilation and sweating, you only want to replace salt and water. So you just drink salt and water. You don't want to, and in fact, you don't even necessarily want to replace water too much, because you're evaporating salt and water, but you can't continue running as you're drinking. You're going to become heavier, and it's going to become a problem. It's going to cause stomach issues. And so what you want to do when you're running, for example, a marathon, is to have just sips of water, but take salt. Because when you're doing extreme athletic performance, particularly running, most runners end up with hyponatremia and hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia meaning too much potassium in their blood, even though they're not eating anything and not drinking anything. This is going to be a natural shift, an ionic shift, as a result of the cells working harder than what they're used to. And so a lot of potassium is going to come out of the cells, and a lot of sodium is going to go into the cells to create the particular energy. It's a respiratory function. So I always tell people to think of our cells like fish. They breathe in the salt water and they exhale, salt water. It's sort of kind of the same thing as a fish would do. All of our cells are in salt water. So basically they're in a huge bubble. Our skin created a huge bubble of salt water. And so we are using salt water as part of respiration, and each of our cells, when we are running a marathon, increase in activity, the muscle cells that are working. And so the continual flow of salt and water in and out of the cells as a result of this respiration is going to change, and more potassium is going to come out of the cells as a result. And so our blood for a marathon runner or similar is going to have much more potassium in it than much sodium. But the amount of water in it is not going to change that much. You're going to be sweating and you will lose a lot of water, but it's not going to affect you directly right away. And so the best thing to do for a runner is just to take little pinches of salt as they go along to sort of increase the salt in the blood. This is going to cause problems after the marathon. And so something that we work with afterwards, because then you have to remove all that extra salt, which can be done very easily. But first, while you're running the marathon, just have salt and just little sips of water. And then when you finish, it's another story all through the activity. I used to weight lift a lot before COVID, of course. And I would have salt water before, during, and after. But during, I would limit how much I drink because of the working of the muscles. You don't want to overload your system with too much suddenly too much water coming in. But salt, yes, you want to add the salt. There are people I talk to who take a whole teaspoon, who are not migraineurs, just weightlifting specialists or trainers, who will take a teaspoon of salt before any kind of weightlifting activity. No water, just a teaspoon of salt.
My husband's a marathon runner. He's run 20 marathons and he's an online coach. And I'm just wondering if he uses the salt that comes in tablets, just like regular salt, just in tablets. So it's easier for him to
Same
swallow
thing.
it.
I'm using salt in a caplet right here.
Yeah,
So this
yeah.
is a salt capsule. It's the same thing because salt, by the way, for those who are watching it and don't know, salt is an emetic and it can make people vomit. It can be used on children. If your child ate something that they shouldn't have, you can give them a lot of salt. They're going to vomit it up and the food or whatever they swallowed will come back up. But for some adults, like for me, it works the same way. So I take it as a capsule or a pill. Same thing.
Okay, but can you just clarify a little bit the glucose connection here? Because I understand that basically you're saying people who are suffering from migraine need to make sure they get enough salt, right? Is that
right?
So?
They need to have more salt than normal, right?
More salt than normal. Okay. And where does the glucose connection come in, and what would that mean, in practice for people who are looking to, address their migraine problem?
Right. So the glucose will come in from several places, of course, what you eat, but it can also come in from your liver, which can release glucose, or the muscles. These all have glycogen storage. And so glycogen is glucose, just in a starch form. Excuse me. And so the most importantly, though, the glucose will come in the form of carbohydrates. And I'm not even talking about eating sugar, because by now we nearly all know that sugar is really bad for you. And a lot of people cut out sugar. But when you're eating a slice of bread or you're eating a potato, I don't know how many people realize that eating a potato, like a baked potato that we all like, is equivalent to something like 20 teaspoons of sugar in carbohydrates. I mean, it's a huge amount. And people will say, well, it's a different sugar from eating sugar. No, it's not. Sugar is sugar. It's exactly the same thing. It doesn't taste sweet because it is in starch form. And we only have sensory organs for monosaccharide, meaning single molecule of glucose. And the starch in the potato is a long chain of glucose molecules connected, at which point we can't taste the sweetness of it. And so what happens is that the starch has to be broken up, which happens past our stomach. It happens in the duodenum, which is the first part of the upper small intestine. And so there, it's suddenly we're hit with 20 teaspoons of sugar equivalent in that spot, which is going to cause a huge insulin spike right there. Right. It's better than eating 20 teaspoons of sugar, because when you eat 20 teaspoons of sugar, you activate insulin bigger, because your body can't judge how much glucose is actually in your mouth, for which the insulin has to be released. And of course, we are also fooling it by having 0-calorie sweeteners, which don't have any glucose in them, but the sweet taste. And we respond to the sweet taste and we release insulin to even looking at sugar or a donut or anything. Television commercials are full of food because they make you hungry, because they release insulin. And so there's a little bit of a difference between having it in a starch form versus in an actual sugar form. But this difference is only in time. It's not in quality of the amount of insulin or the speed with which the insulin is going to activate and release and cause trouble. It's just really a delayed time until the starch is broken up into sugar. So it isn't necessarily the eating of sugar per se, but it's the eating of carbohydrates that is the problem for migraineurs.
So you recommend migraine sufferers use a low carb way of eating?
Low carb, and I don't recommend the ketogenic. A lot of people who have migraines try ketogenic and they say, well, I've reduced my migraine, but I still have migraines. And so a low carb itself is also, I reduce my migraine, but it's not fully gone. And I still can control my menstrual migraines or can control my barometric pressure migraines. The best way of eating for a migraineur is actually carnivore. And that is because when a person eats carnivore, that person tends to overeat protein a little bit. And of course, there's protein synthesis for everybody. If you reach the minimum protein synthesis start, which is based on the leucine amount that you ate and your body requires to start synthesis. And then each person, this is age and activity dependent, has a maximum ability of synthesizing protein. And if you pass that, then whatever protein you still have in you is going to convert to glucose. And that glucose can help because it's a slow release glucose based on how your body actually needs glucose. It's a demand-driven glucose rather than when you eat a cantaloupe, you ate the whole thing at once. It was not demand-driven. It was just given. And then it has to be converted to fat and stored and has to be taken out of your blood really quickly. When you eat protein, it's going to behave differently because the mechanism of conversion from protein into glucose is a little by little stepwise process. And so it's going to be slower, it's going to be controlled. And so people, for example, who get lots of sugar crashes when they switch over to a low carbohydrate diet, the carnivore is perfect. And they can eat right before sleep. They can eat a little bit of meat. I usually prepare red meat for those who have some sugar crash issues at night, like early morning migraines. And it prevents it because it stabilizes the blood glucose overnight, even though it's excess protein and it converts to glucose. It converts to glucose at a different rate. And so it may wake the person up into a protein sweat if you way overdose your protein. But if you're just a little bit over, it just gives you enough to sort of supply you without having any trouble. And it balances your glucose and insulin really well.
Very interesting. So before we conclude this interview, Angela, is there like a real take home message or something that you'd like our listeners, to take with them from this interview, or something, a message that you would like to convey to them?
Yeah, I do. And I think that just recently, the most important message I could get from my group, so many members suddenly joined, and everybody is basically surprised about the importance of salt. And also they are confused about how to take salt. And they have the same question as you did. Well, doesn't it increase my blood pressure? But they will have no problems taking a medication. And so if I have to choose between a medication and salt, honestly, right, the salt is okay because it's part of our everyday life, but the medication is not. And so what I would like the migraineurs as a last thought to consider is, do they really truly believe that a medication is better for them than taking a little salt? Because if they believe that, then by all means, enjoy the medication and see if it works. And hopefully it does. And hopefully you get some benefits. But I would suspect that 100% people will say, no, salt is better than the medication. It's safer. It's healthier. It's part of our everyday life. It's been part of our whole human process. All of animals, elephants, they all dig salt. So we know that salt is essential. So if it's an essential mineral that we must eat, whereas a drug is a drug, then why are we scared of eating salt? So it should not be a problem of taking salt, even if the person has high blood pressure. It is still an essential nutrient, even for a person with hypertension, even for a person with cancer, even for a person with any kind of a health condition. Salt is an essential mineral. It's a metal. It's essential. We must eat it So eating a little more is not going to harm you.
I think that's such an important message. That really hit home for me. Like, what do you prefer? Like having something that nature provides, or
Exactly.
taking medication that has side effects and you really don't know the long-term effects of it.
And just to add to just one more thing, which is important, is that we're looking at our body and we don't see salt. We see bone and protein and skin and these kind of things. But every single thing in our body has a lot of salt in it. So if we took a person and we separated all the minerals and vitamins and everything else in the person, the number one mineral that we have in every single cell, which takes up, depending on the size of the person, between 0.5 to 1.5 pounds, so almost a kilo, right, is salt. And so if we have so much in us, if we take an extra 0.5 teaspoon, is that really that big of a deal?
Yeah. A very good question. So where can, people find you, Angela, if they're looking for you? I know you have your book, right? Which is in its second edition now, and it's named Fighting the Migraine Epidemic, Complete Guide, How to Treat and Prevent Migraines Without Medicine. But
Correct.
other than the book, how can they find you?
Okay, so there are many ways to find me, of course. There is a Facebook group, which I now open, so I can tell them where to find me. And that's called facebook.com/group/migraine sufferers. The name of the group itself is Migraine Sufferers Who Want to Heal by the Stanton Migraine Protocol. So that's the main migraine group. And currently it has 14.4 thousand members, so over 14,000 members. And I have other groups too, but this would be the main group. And if they can't find it, then just find me on Facebook. And I am found under Angela A. Stanton, PhD, all one word. So that's my username, Angela A. Stanton, PhD. And they can, of course, find me on Twitter. My handle is @migrainebook, one word, migrainebook. Mm-hmm. They can send email, angela@migraine-book.com. I'm on LinkedIn. They can find me under my name. I'm on Instagram as Dr. Angela A. Stanton. It's just everywhere they look. If they look for now, usually I'm going by Angela A. Stanton because there are Angela Stanton, many other Angela Stantons. So, and I have often been confused by other Angela Stantons before, but it's Angela A. Stanton.
Angela A. Stanton.
Right. And then if they put the PhD or doctor, whichever, they're going to find me any which way.
Well, I really want to thank you so much, Angela, for this very, this is a subject that isn't talked about very much, and certainly not in the connection of nutrition and carbohydrates. And I think that this is really, good news for migraine sufferers. I'm glad to say that I personally don't suffer from migraines, but I have friends who do, and I know how much of an obstacle it can be in their lives. And so I think
it can be, but it's also a positive, because when you talk about nutrition, those who don't have migraines seem to have a tough time, like quitting carbohydrates, moving off these things. But migraineurs get an instant feedback. You're eating a slice of cake, you're going to be hit with a migraine. So we have an easier time. So I'm actually grateful to be a migraineur because I have a much easier time changing my diet and quitting these things than other people do. So it's not a bad thing.
Super motivation. I get that. I have that the same, that because sugar just affects my mood so badly that that the suffering just isn't worth it. Exactly. But it took me so long to recognize that, right? And I would assume it might be the same for migraine sufferers. So thank you so much for joining us on this Kick Sugar Summit. And
thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure meeting you.
And it was a pleasure meeting you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this interview. And before you go, do one more thing. Stop, think back on the interview while it's fresh in your mind, and write down your favorite takeaway in a special dedicated journal. If you do this, at the end of the summit, you'll have a page or two of nuggets of wisdom to guide you forward. And remember, this is just the beginning. At the end of the summit, you'll be invited to attend a free webinar where I will personally summarize the key insights of our speakers and pull it all together into a practical plan of action. You can also check out our Facebook page where you can connect with others and ask questions. and our Kick Sugar Coach podcast and YouTube channel for additional inspiration. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next interview.